We are secrets to each other. Each one's life a novel no one else has read. Even joined in bonds of love, we're linked to one another by such slender threads. Just between us, I think it's time for us to recognize the differences we sometimes fear to show. Just between us, I think it's time for us to realize the spaces in between leave room for you and I to grow.
Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 114 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre. If you're a fan of the rock group Rush, then you likely recognize the opening, which were some of the lyrics from the song Entre Nous, which is French for Between Us, from the 1980 album Permanent Waves. Those lyrics were written by Neil Peart, who is the drummer and lyricist for the band. Neil died at the age of 67 on January 7th, 2020, of glioblastoma, an aggressive form of brain cancer. Suddenly, you were gone from all the lives you left your mark upon. I remember. Those are more lyrics from Neil. They're from the song After Image off the 1984 album Grace Under Pressure. That was the very first Rush album that I fell in love with, and it led to a lifetime of being inspired by the man's lyrics, his music, and his writing. This is a special episode of the Stark Reflections podcast. It's one of those special episodes in which I pause to pay tribute to and to thank people who have inspired me. Thanks for the Inspiration is a style of show that will appear from time to time in the regular schedule for this podcast. As writers, we often absorb elements from the world, the places and the people around us. We observe, we ask questions, we speculate, we listen, we watch, we feel, and we write so much of that down, which gets reintegrated like some sort of sausage creation into the stories and words and worlds we share with our readers. Thanks for the Inspiration episodes are my attempt to acknowledge and say thanks to the people, places, and things that have helped to either feed the muse or perhaps just to feed the very soul and makeup of the writer behind that writing. And in this particular episode, I pay tribute to and offer up my heartfelt thanks to Neil Peart. This episode is sponsored by the patrons of the Stark Reflections podcast. For as little as $1, $3, or $5 a month, patrons get access to additional audio content. If you are a patron, then you probably have listened to an episode where I actually quoted other podcasts, including, because this is a special Neil Peart episode, a quote from an interview with Neil Peart where I reflected on the work that Neil and the band put in to every single concert that they perform live, and I talked about that as a reflection for the writer. So episodes where I reflect on things that I get from other podcasts and other interviews are part of that, as well as additional text content and video content, and that's available to patrons over on patreon.com/starkreflections, and this is a huge shout out and thank you to my special patrons who help pay for additional episodes like this, as well as my time in producing the show. Now I'm going to skip the personal update of this particular episode and get right into the main content, which is this thank you to Neil Peart. It is Tuesday, January 14th when I'm recording this. Now I wanted to record this episode right away, but I have to admit I couldn't talk about Neil Peart without starting to sob. No, we weren't close personal friends. Now, apart from seeing him on stage numerous times, we never actually met in person. But he still had a tremendous impact on me as a person, as a writer. So I certainly felt the loss. Neil died on Tuesday, January 7th. Most of the world found out on Friday, January 10th. I immediately did two things when I found out. I texted my good friend Kevin J. Anderson, who is a close friend of Neil, and I called my dear pal, Peter Mahijic, who introduced me to Rush. And when I called Pete, he hadn't heard yet, and I actually broke down, and I couldn't speak when I was trying to tell him the news. He mentioned later that he thought I'd been calling to tell him that my mom had died. That's how emotional I was. And when Kevin called me just a few minutes later after that to talk to me about it, you see, as one of Neil's close friends, he'd actually known for years that Neil had brain cancer, but he kept the entire thing a secret. He honored Neil's wish to keep that a secret. Now, that must have been devastating and so difficult for him. But Kevin and I ended up working our way through a conversation that was riddled with all kinds of pauses as the two of us openly wept. But I'll get back to my connections to Neil via Kevin and Pete. Let me backtrack a little bit first. Neil Peart, who was born on September 12, 1952 in Hamilton, Ontario, died in Santa Monica on January 7th, 2020. Rush and Peart's family made the announcement late on Friday, January 10th, and this is the announcement from the Rush website. It is with broken hearts and the deepest sadness that we must share the terrible news that on Tuesday, our friend, soul brother, and bandmate of over 45 years, Neil has lost his incredibly brave 3.5-year battle with brain cancer. I first learned about Peart when my dear friend Pete Mahijic insisted that I listen to the 1984 album Grace Under Pressure. See, I'd been spending a lot of time thinking and reading about anxieties over potential nuclear war, and a group of students had come to the school and talked about nuclear disarmament, and I was interested in learning more about that. I was reading everything I could. Pete sat me down and said, "This Rush album," and he had been a Rush fan for a long, long time, and I had been ignoring the band, but he said, "This Rush album has themes that would be reminiscent of that for me." And so he made me a cassette tape, and certainly the album's first track, Distant Early Morning, brought that to mind, as did so many of the other tracks, Enemy Within and Red Sector A, although I later learned of Peart's inspiration for this song, Red Sector A, which was a song of a generic prison camp, but that it had been inspired by fellow bandmate Geddy Lee's mother's accounts of surviving the Holocaust. Now, I listened to Grace Under Pressure over and over and over on the cassette tape that Pete had recorded for me. Then I went out and bought the album. Then I bought the actual cassette. You see, I fell in love with the thoughtful and pensive lyrics. I fell in love with the musical styling. I fell in love with everything about this band that seemed to me to be a thinking person's band. It seemed to me to be nerds who were interested and concerned about the same things I was interested in. They seemed to be stories and songs that were inspired by books, and I was such a passionate reader at the time. This band was something that was for me. Now, as an interesting aside, earlier in January 2020, an anthology of science fiction stories called Galaxia was published, and I was invited in late 2019 to be involved in it if I had a science fiction story. I ended up sending them a story. Grace Under Pressure was the title of the story. Now, I had originally written that story to try to sell it to Kevin J. Anderson, a huge Rush fan, of course, for an anthology that he was editing years ago. Because I knew he was a Rush fan, I titled it that as a nod to our favorite band. I wanted to get his attention. My main character's last name is Grace, and so it was basically him in a tight spot. And of course, I alluded to various Rush things in the stories, as I have done over the years. Now, I didn't sell the story to Kevin, but I was able to get it into this other anthology, and it has just been released. But Grace Under Pressure was, again, that introduction to Rush for me, where I sat there with the album and I read the lyrics, and I even conceptualized a stage play that I wanted to write, which was the tale of the world coming to an end, of some sort of nuclear holocaust, some sort of war where there's just survivors in the ruins, and maybe the robots took over, like in Skynet and Terminator, because that was around the same time that had come out. And I had imagined taking the album and turning it into a stage play where the some of the characters would sing some of the songs, and I spent months dreaming and conceptualizing that with Grace Under Pressure. But then after Grace Under Pressure, I realized there was so much to rush I had to get into. So I went and I got the album Signals, which also resonated with me with songs like Subdivisions and The Analog Kid. And they were stark reminders of growing up as a nerd who never felt like he fit in. Now, here's some of the lyrics from Subdivisions. Drawn like moths, we drift into the city, the timeless old attraction, cruising for the action, lit up like a firefly just to feel the living night. Some will sell their dreams for small desires, or lose the race to rats, get caught in ticking traps, and start to dream of somewhere to relax their restless flight. Somewhere out of a memory of lighted streets on quiet nights. Subdivisions in the high school halls, in the shopping malls, conform or be cast out. Subdivisions in the basement bars, in the backs of cars, be cool or be cast out. Any escape might help to smooth the unattractive truth, but the suburbs have no charms to soothe the restless dreams of youth. And so in a column I had written in the Gully Gazette, which was Levack District High School's newspaper, I ended up quoting from that. Now, this was a December issue, of course, being such a great newspaper, we didn't actually say the year, but it was most likely 1987 when I wrote this. And the column was called Quoth by Mark Leslie, and it says, Quoth is based on lyrics taken from the words of Canadian lyricist Neil Peart. So this particular Quoth column was titled Drawn Like Moths. And here's what I wrote. Peer pressure. Conform, be cool, just like us. Don't wear that shirt, it's not our style. Look at that nerd, his pants and tie don't match. It's everywhere. Even though phrases such as the ones mentioned above are seldom heard, peer pressure is a state of mind born of the fear of being alone, being a little different, the fear of not being accepted, of being cast out. You'll find peer pressure at its highest in a small town such as ours, in an atmosphere where everyone knows everyone else, or at least thinks they know everyone else. Small but powerful applies not only to our school athletes, but to our peer pressure. Surely there's some escape. There's always a funny way to look at individuals who do not succumb to this pressure. They're the ones who dare to be different, but look at all the people in our world today. Being an individual, being different is now a fad. Things have changed enough that there's peer pressure to be like everyone else and peer pressure to be different from everyone else. There seems to be no escape of this social fear. But there must be. Why sit around and define what peer pressure is and challenge yourself to be different? Why can't a person just be him or herself without having to be different? Because people are critics, and there's no denying the inborn fears that cause us to put down others in order to feel better about ourselves. But where's the escape? It's needed by so many who just can't realistically face society. Just as Peart said, any escape might help to soothe the unattractive truth. And so, people escape to the big cities. They escape the small town pressures such as the ones inherent in our community by becoming one of a vast population. They escape the fear of conforming by conforming in a different manner. Cities of conformed people all afraid of being cast out. As Peart said, nowhere is the dreamer or the misfit so alone. So that is my attempt to be all philosophical and intelligent and smart by riffing off of really cool things that Neil Peart wrote. But this is just an example. I mean, this was a young Mark. Was Mark 17 at the time? Maybe 16, 17 at the time. This was Mark trying to cut his chops as a writer. This was Mark being inspired by Neil Peart. And I wrote plenty of articles inspired by things that I thought about because Neil wrote about those things. The other thing is the Analog Kid. The song lyrics from Analog Kid, they go this way. Too many hands on my time, too many feelings, too many things on my mind. When I leave, I don't know what I'm hoping to find. And when I leave, I don't know what I'm leaving behind. I mean, that was a song that spoke to me so much of the restless spirit that I had as a youth, of wanting to get away, of knowing that there was more things out there in heaven and earth, yes, of course, than were dreamt of in our philosophies, because I was also big into Hamlet and Shakespeare and things like that. But I remember that restless feeling, the fear of leaving, but the desire to want to get out and leave that small town. Constantly throughout my life, the lyrics from Rush were always being referred to. Rush became a centerpiece in many ways for my friendship with Pete Mahijic and Steve Gaydos and John Ellis. They're three guys who've been my friends for my entire life. Nerds, all four of us, of course. Now, Rush music and Rush lyrics were a constant part of our communication with one another over the years. Heck, if I had a dime for every birthday where we would quote something like from the song Time Stands Still, I'd be rolling in a ton of money right now. Time stands still. I'm not looking back, but I want to look around me now. See more of the people and the places that surround me now. Time stands still. Summer's growing fast, nights growing colder, children growing up, old friends growing older. Freeze this moment a little bit longer. Make each sensation a little bit stronger. Experience slips away. The innocence slips away. I constantly quote the song Time Stands Still. Every time there's a moment of reflection, it's often a birthday, it could be the end of the year. I mean, obviously at the end of every summer in the fall, I'm constantly quoting that thing about summer going and all my friends growing older, as we all are every year. But again, there's so many moments in my life where I pause and reflect on Rush lyrics. I think anyone who knows me knows I will constantly find some sort of reference to a Rush lyric no matter what conversation I'm in. I try really, really hard not to force it on people, but it just happens. Just like I will constantly find some sort of quote from Monty Python to fit in. But that's the pervasive nature of the lyrics that got into my head from Rush songs and continued to get into my head from Rush songs as the years went by. But going back to my discovery, so after Grace Under Pressure and Signals, I moved on to get more of their backlist albums like Fly By Night and their very first album, Rush. The first album did not include Peart, so many of the lyrics weren't as philosophical and pensive, but I remember John Ellis and I used to play tracks from it, in my bedroom in Levac before heading to the high school dances, like just playing it as loud as we could and jumping around the room and dancing like a bunch of nerds and singing along, trying to do high-pitched singing like Geddy's voice. And in particular, the song In the Mood, because as the song lyrics go roughly, hey baby, it's 7:45. And it was roughly 7:45 in the evening when we were listening to it and getting ready to go to the dance, all sweaty and our hair all over the place. Yeah, I had hair at one point in time. Now, the title track off of Fly By Night has been a song that has been with me through virtually every single significant change in my life over the decades. I remember first showing up at Steve Gaydos' place as he's just getting ready to get into the car to go south, to go to college. When he moved away to college, his parents were there and he's getting ready to take him on that trip. And I remember showing up with a little ghetto blaster and playing the song Fly By Night and probably having a bit of a cry because, my buddy was moving away to college. But then that song became my acknowledgement change song for every single significant change in my life over the years. And in talking with other people, I know that has been a thing for them. Interestingly enough, Peart was writing that song. That was the very first album he did with Rush, and obviously that was a major change in his life. Although I think from if I'm remembering my reading properly, and if you're listening to this and you're a Rush fan and I got it wrong, do please correct me. But he may have written it based on when he moved overseas, when he moved to England as well. He may have been talking a little bit about that, or he could have even been talking about the change of suddenly joining Rush and that being another change in his life. But again, that's one of those songs that I've always gone back to so many times. Now, as I said, it's rare for me to get into any sort of meaningful conversation without bringing up something from a Rush song lyric. I mean, there's so many songs. I quoted Entre Nous at the beginning of this podcast, or The Spirit of Radio. There's Cinderella Man, Circumstances, Madrigal, Limelight, Marathon, Mystic Rhythms or Dreamline, Far Cry, Caravan. Oh, who am I kidding? There's too many songs and so many lyrics that are so meaningful to me that even though I'm being very indulgent here in talking about it, I could go on for hours and hours. And anyone who knows me personally knows I will go on for hours and hours about Rush. Now, one person who's been very patient with me, and God bless her for this, but I met Liz in 2014. My marriage had ended almost 20 years, and Rush was also beginning to near retirement. And as I was getting to know Liz, I shared so many of the songs and the meaning of the band to me. It's music and some personal songs that just the two of us that we danced together to, and songs that actually have meaning to her now. And I shared my love of this trio of musicians, of these amazing people that kind of were almost like best friends to me, and I acted like they were best friends. And Liz and I listened to plenty of their songs together. We watched the DVD documentary Beyond the Lighted Stage together. And then seeing the backstory of the band, it really helped her understand the depth of the importance that they had to me. She recognized how me and my friends who thought of ourselves as nerds still, even as adults, that we identified so closely to these three beautiful, brilliant nerds who were creating amazing music. Liz and I attended their final tour, the R40 tour, together, which was so absolutely special to me that I got a chance to show her, to have her feel what it was like to be there. It's kind of funny because there's always these jokes about, hey, I saw some girls at the Rush concert. And Liz has a picture of me waiting in line to get into the washroom during the break in the middle of the show. And obviously she just walked right into the women's room. And of course there was a gigantic lineup in the men's room because unlike regular events where it's equal men and women, there's typically a smaller percentage of women there. Now, I'm not saying that women are not Rush fans, because I've known plenty of amazing women who are Rush fans over the years, but typically there's a lot more guys there. So that was kind of funny when Liz was so excited and happy to see that I was the one who had to wait in line while she zipped in and out of the washroom really, really quickly. But that's it for the lyrics and the music. What I really want to get into is I want to talk about Neil as a writer, and that's the next thing that I'm going to want to share with you, because that's where the resonance really, really struck home for me. When I found out that Neil Peart also wrote fiction and nonfiction, I was beside myself with absolute joy. I gobbled up everything he wrote, from his very first co-authored short story to his first nonfiction travel memoir, and all the way through his writing career. I have loved all of his books, but if I had to pick a favorite, I think it might be Traveling Music, the soundtrack to my life and times. It is an amazing biography of Neil's own life, told through the music he listened to throughout much of it. And I loved the way that he did that, talking about the very eclectic and the different music that he listened to. And he was so open-minded about the music he listened to and loved, and so appreciative of so many things. It really gave me a good feel for that. One of my favorite pictures of me and my son when he was just a baby is in the year 2004. And it was the two of us having an afternoon nap, but on the nightstand there's a copy of Traveling Music by Neil Peart, which is there because I was reading it at the time. And when I see that picture, I think of those moments in time. I think about the way Neil talked about moments in time as they can be captured by music. And that's the amazing power that music can have, because it can transport us like that. When I see that picture, I'm transported to being the proud and overtired father that I was. And and it gives me such pleasure. I just bought the audiobook. I want to read the book, but I want to listen to it this time while I'm doing other things. And then reflecting both on the original reading of the book, reflecting on some of the lessons that Neil shares, and also reflecting on my life. Now, Alexander and I bonded over Rush when he was really, really young. I used to put on 2112, especially that instrumental opening and the overture, etc., with in the basement of the house, where I would flash, because I had different lights that I could flash on and off, and we play it really, really loud, and the two of us would be jumping around and dancing to it and having a really, really good time. I remember going on car trips and playing Red Barchetta for him for the very, very first time, and saying this is a science fiction story about the future where cars are not as people don't have cars that are powered by engines and gas. They're powered by different things, and so this is an opportunity for someone to actually experience what it's like to drive on a country road. We've listened to so many different things over the years. The one thing I did not get a chance to do is I never got a chance to take him to a Rush concert, and that's one thing that we won't have. But I'm pretty sure that as he gets into music, as he continues to get older, I'll continue to share my love and my passion for Rush with him. Now, going back to Neil's writing and the closeness that I've felt with him, I never had the pleasure of knowing him personally, but I am good friends with Kevin J. Anderson, and Kevin has been a long-time close friend of Neil. Kevin and Neil became friends when Kevin was publishing his very first book. He was listening to the album Grace Under Pressure and Resurrection Inc., which was his very first novel. He ended up mailing the novel to Getty, Alex, and Neil, and basically said, hey, I was listening to your album over and over while working on this book. I thought you guys might like this. And if you read Resurrection Inc., which is an amazing novel, you'll know that there's so many references and allusions to stuff from Grace Under Pressure and Rush lyrics. So many Easter eggs. It's really, really fun. But Neil ended up writing back to Kevin. I think it was like a year or two later. He found it in the pile of fan letters, etc. Went, oh, cool, a science fiction book. Looks interesting. Picked it up, read it, wrote Kevin, and Neil would write, 10, 12-page handwritten letters. They started a correspondence. They became friends. Then they became really, really close friends, and they ended up working on stories together. So Kevin and Neil were really, really close, but considering how private a person Neil was, and the fact that he enjoyed working hard as a drummer, a lyricist, and a writer, but he was never, ever comfortable in the role of celebrity. He was never comfortable in the way that fans would fawn over and place celebrities on pedestals. So understanding that about him, I was perfectly fine, never trying to push through that veil, never trying to take advantage of that friendship that we shared with Kevin. Why make someone uncomfortable for no good reason? I mean, I could admire and I could respect the man and his phenomenal work without ever having to, rush up to him and gush in person about how awesome he was and how incredibly powerful and positive the inspiration he had on my life. No, I never got the chance for him to know that, but I'm pretty sure he knew that he moved a lot of people. Here's a line from Moving Pictures, from the song Limelight from Rush. Living in a fisheye lens, caught in the camera eye, I have no heart to lie. I can't pretend a stranger is a long-awaited friend. Now, with that quote, I'm going to play a very short clip of Neil talking about that in an interview that he did for CBC Music with Jesse Keno's Gooden back in 2014, because it really illustrates how Neil just wanted to connect with people on a personal level, not as a celebrity.
It so keeps me rooted. There's not a single day goes by that I don't have a conversation with somebody in a gas station or somebody in a diner or the motel, and just regular human-to-human interaction. And that's what I was saying about the bubble that touring can sometimes be, and when everybody looks at you a certain way and talks at you a certain way, it can be alienating and, for me, very uncomfortable. And so that's my professional milieu, fine, but I don't have to live in that bubble, and that's the greatest reward. I was saying before, it's not about the motorcycling necessarily or the scenery or the landscapes. It's about the mental state of getting away from that and thinking about what I'm traveling through, and other people's lives. That's what I love being in tune with every day. And I drive past people working in the fields and think about them. And I drive past people going about their jobs and going about their lives, and kids at school, and this whole life's rich pageant, right, that's going around us all the time. When you live in a bubble, it's hard to stay in touch with that. And that's the world, especially as a writer. You need to stay in touch with, right, other people's lives, or the essence of what I want to do in sharing won't be possible, because you're writing from some ivory tower to people whose lives you don't even have the slightest notion of, right? Absolutely. So that would be a tremendous handicap as a writer.
And I guess it gives you like a sense of anonymity as well, as opposed to private jet to guy on a bike.
Yeah, I mean, you can protect your privacy in those ways. That's a good analogy. Is that, inevitably, one of the hardest lessons we learned along the way, fortunately, we became popular fairly gradually so we could adapt to it and help each other adapt to it. But yeah, there's the first time you ever have to hire security for your dressing room door. It's like, what? For the first few years, our dressing room door was open to anyone who ever wanted to come in. Chances, happens that nobody did.
Yeah.
So that was the reality. And then suddenly when things change, and one of our live albums around that time, I wrote a little note in it, we're sorry for any friends that we're out of touch with and all that. And just remember, we didn't change, everybody else did. And that's what it seems like to you at the time. So yeah, you can put up, in the song Limelight, one can put up barriers to keep oneself intact, or you can jump right out of that. And it just occurred to me that those are the two choices, right? You can either put up barriers around you or get out of that circle, because people don't expect to see me. And there are many times I've been around someplace and somebody with a Rush t-shirt on, and will just not notice me because I'm some guy at a gas station or some guy sitting in a diner. They're not expecting to see me there. Yes. So I always love those moments when I realize that I've achieved that independence. And I just want to be that guy. I like having conversations with people on an everyday basis. I don't want them looking at me like some alien being.
It seems like you're a man of extremes. Like, you don't just drum. You drum on one of the largest kits there is. You don't just ride motorcycles. You ride 50,000 miles.
I'm extremist.
Even when you describe your appetite for reading too, it seems like a voracious appetite for reading. Like, I guess is that what got you where you are as a drummer even?
I would expect that it all comes down to a kind of restlessness, because when people talk about boredom, for example, I can honestly say I've never been bored for a second in my life, but I've always found another way not to be. And like, if I have to go to a medical appointment, I'm like, I bring a book with me. So that waiting is not going to be a hardship. But the early days of touring, when all that dead time was hanging on me, reading, portable, useful, nurturing, all that stuff. So I think I combat, you learn to adapt to your own personality, and the extremes do come in there too. Yeah, I wanted to read every book ever written. Drumming-wise, my determination was more important than talent early on. I think for most things you do have to have a bit of a knack, but I had to work so hard to learn so many things, but I was relentless in terms of determination. And with traveling, when I've got a day, I'm tempted by what's the most excellent thing I can do, which might be way too far, way too long, but I'm going to go for that because it's the most excellent thing I can do. And with writing, it just seems unstinting in the same way, because I just kind of know when I've done my best on it, and maybe an editor can help make it better, and maybe somebody else could have written it better, but I have a good built-in sense of this is the best I can do.
So again, when you listen to that, you listen to how he just loved to connect with people as an average guy, not being seen as a celebrity. That was the kind of thing that he preferred. And so I never did get a chance to connect with him. Probably I would have loved to believe that I could control myself and not gush and all those things. I guess the closest I suppose I ever got to Neil was when I republished a short story that Neil Peart and Kevin J. Anderson wrote called Drum Beats. And I republished it in the 2012 anthology Tesseract 16, Parnassus Unbound. Now, Tesseract is an anthology series to spotlight Canadian authors, and Anderson is the only American that I'm aware of to make it into the series because his co-author Peart was Canadian. So I reached out to Kevin and said, hey, I remember reading Drum Beats when it was first published in Shock Rock 2, edited by Jeff Gelb. I would love it if you would consider me reprinting that story in this anthology, because the story stuck with me. I love it so much. And I had read the story well before Kevin and I had met one another. We had met one another at the conference and bonded over our love of Rush and craft beer. And so Kevin talked to Neil, basically agreed that they would publish it, and Kevin got into that anthology because Neil was the Canadian, even though Kevin was my conduit. So that was kind of a cool experience that I got to bring that story back after so many years. But then, not too long after, a few years later, when Kevin was in town to launch the novel Clockwork Angels, which was a tie-in to the Rush album of the same name, and a novel that Kevin and Neil co-wrote together, Kevin stayed at my place in Hamilton, and he was going out to the celebratory a dinner for the book launch with Neil and ECW and the editor Jen that they worked with on that. And so Kevin brought a copy of the anthology Tesseract 16 to dinner that night so Neil could sign a copy for me. And so, as I said, it was an honor for me to bring back that story into print that I've long adored. And I was really excited that I actually have a signed copy signed by both Kevin and Neil, which I, of course, treasure to this day. But then, earlier this month, last week, the week of January 6th, I had been working on finalizing the editing of Pulp House magazine that I was just turning into Dean Wesley Smith and WMG Publishing. And in that, I wanted to do the same theme. And so I had writers writing stories on the theme. And I'd reached out to Kevin and said, oh my God, I'd love to reprint Drum Beats again. So I had just turned in the reprint of Drum Beats that's going to be published later in 2020. And then, of course, shortly after that, I got the news. Speaking of Kevin and writing, and we go way back, bonded obviously over Rush and our love of Halloween and craft beer and all the things. We were enjoying craft beers on a patio at the Winking Judge in Hamilton. And the Winking Judge, of course, is my favorite bar in Hamilton. And that's when we were sitting there. I remember it was just like a cool summer night. And he invited me to submit a story to the anthology that he was co-editing that was going to be called 2113. And it was going to feature stories inspired by the music of Rush. Now, the title story was going to be written by Kevin, and it was going to be a sequel to the story told in the Rush album 2112. And he told me, he said, pick a song that hasn't already been spoken for and send me something. So I chose one of my absolute favorite Rush songs, Losing It. And I wrote a story entitled Some Are Born to Save the World. Now, the beautiful and haunting song Losing It, it explores in two different sections. It explores the lives of a writer who can no longer write or create, and a dancer who can no longer dance as they age and their minds and their bodies begin to fail them. It's a beautiful, haunting song. Here are just some of the lyrics. Some are born to move the world, to live their fantasies. Most of us just dream about the things we'd like to be. Sadder still to watch it die than never to have known it. For you, the blind, who once could see, the bell tolls for thee. And that was off of the song Losing It from Signals, the album Signals from Rush, obviously written by Neil Peart. Now, the story I wrote, which is obviously riffing on the lyrics, is Some Are Born to Save the World, not to move the world, but to save the world. And my story was about a superhero who could no longer save people as he reaches old age and his own body and powers begin to fail him. And of course, like I have in many of my stories, I planted all kinds of Easter eggs for different Rush lyrics in that story. And that came out in the anthology 2113. One of the most amazing things I can tell about 2113 is when I have an author table, and that's one of the books that's on my author table, because the font for the title 2113 and the artwork on it by Hugh Syme looks so much like, and it's reminiscent of the album 2112, I can tell Rush fans immediately, because it doesn't matter how far, across the arena or the room that they are from me, they see that cover and they just bolt, make a beeline for the cover. They don't say anything. Their eyes and their mouth are open wide, and you can tell they're a Rush fan. I usually go, Rush fan? It's like, yeah, how did you know? And I was like, well, I can tell because you have that stunned look on your face like I always get every time I hear a new Rush song. So In any case, that was published. The rights reverted back to me. So in late 2019, Dean Wesley Smith had reached out and said, hey, do you have anything for a story bundle themed on saving the world? I didn't have anything right away, like at least book length. So I bundled together a collection of short stories, all themed on people like saving other people. And I called it Nocturnal Saves. It was 7 stories. And of course, the title story, or the lead story, was Some Are Born to Save the World, which obviously inspired by losing it. Now, that was only available for a very limited time. It was like a month long. You could get it, and then it's done. So when that finished, I put the collection aside. I looked at it and said, okay, I themed that specifically for saving the world for Dean, but I think there's something there. So I put it aside and I figured, okay, sometime in early 2020, I'm going to revise it. I'm going to adjust the theme a little bit and change it from saving the world to heroes. And so around the same time, I had been toying with it in the back of my head. I decided, okay, I'm going to rename the collection Nobody's Hero in honor of the 1993 Rush song of the same name. That was around the same time Neil had actually died. Now, I didn't know he had died till several days later, like the rest of the world, but I had decided that. And so here's some of the lyrics from Nobody's Hero, that 1993 song from Rush. As the years went by, we drifted apart. When I heard that he was gone, I felt a shadow cross my heart. But he's nobody's hero. Saves a drowning child, cures a wasting disease. Hero. Lands the crippled airplane, solves great mysteries. Hero. Not the handsome actor who plays a hero's role. Not the glamour girl who'd love to sell her soul. If anybody's buying, nobody's hero. So that's a beautiful, touching song. It actually has so many elements. Neil talks about a friend of his who was homosexual and invited him into his life, who had later died of AIDS, and he had learned of that. And it was just a really, really tough thing, that even though he hadn't contacted him for years, he had felt that loss. He even spoke about, from St. Catharines, from the town where he grew up, of this young girl who had been kidnapped and tortured and raped, and just how difficult it was. Even though he never knew her, he knew the family, and tried to understand how they could try to understand how to believe in the goodness of people when something so horrifying, so terrifying could happen to them. And again, so those are two of the things he addresses in the song Nobody's Hero. But that's why I released the book earlier this week and dedicated it, of course, naturally, to Neil, as one small token nod of thanks for all of the inspiration that he has given me. And so many millions of others, of course. I recognize that I just spent a lot of time reminiscing about how inspired, how much I adore, admire, and respect the work that Neil has done as a musician, as a writer, as a lyricist. And I will go on. I have written tons of things. You saw I did that when I was in high school. I was writing about it. I've written about the power and impact that Neil's lyrics and his words have had on me as a writer, as a person. I constantly reflect in conversation with people. If you and I are ever in a conversation, be warned, I will probably raise Rush lyrics at some point in time. And I went on and reflected on those things. And this is just a minor segment of the power and impact that Neil and his work has had on me. I will never be able to properly thank Neil for what he did, for what he gave to the universe. But I have so many of his books, so many of his songs, so many of the interviews he has done, so many of the writing he has shared that continue to inspire me and inform me as a person, as a writer. And maybe, just maybe, I can dream, or I can aspire to be able to inspire other people with my own writing, with the things that I put out into the universe. Even if it's 1/100th of what Neil has done for me, I will know that that is a hugely successful thing that I have done. To write, to inspire others, to create things, to move people with words and story is one of the most powerful things we could do. And Neil did that for me for most of my entire life and will continue to do that. Thank you for indulging me if you've listened this far as I've gone on about my love and my passion and my respect for Neil Peart. Thank you, Neil, for all that you've done. Thank you for the inspiration. Rest in peace. You made a positive and important, impactful difference in my life and in the lives of so many others. Thank you for the inspiration. Well, that's it for episode 114 of the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. This is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. Thanks for indulging me as I went back in time and I reflected on how Neil Peart has inspired me over the years. And it's funny, as long as I talked, I didn't even go back to the beginning of how I used the opening of the song The Camera Eye for a Levack District High School video song that I had created when I created a video when I was in high school introducing grade 8s to Levack District High School. I never even got into the fact that I used the Rush song Witch Hunt in a grade 13 history class about the Salem witch trials. I mean, my project for that was I actually filmed the video for the song. We went out and pretended to burn Steve alive on a stake as if he was a witch. And again, I used the song and some of the lyrics from there as well as the video, comparing the Salem witch trial and the hunt there, the witch hunt, to the evils of censorship based on a few lines from the song. They say there are strangers who threaten us, or immigrants and infidels. They say there is strangeness to danger us in our theaters and bookstore shelves. That those who know what's best for us must rise and save us from ourselves. Quick to judge, quick to anger, slow to understand. Ignorance and prejudice and fear walk hand in hand. Yet more lyrics, no matter where I look, are constantly influencing, constantly inspiring me, constantly allowing me to reflect on things. I've reflected on things from Witch Hunt back when I was in high school and I was concerned about censoring books and things like that. And I look at the lyrics now from Witch Hunt and I think about how pertinent it is to today's society. Neil Peart was pertinent in the things that he wrote that will continue to live on. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble on about this in this special Thanks for the Inspiration episode. Again, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre. You can find show notes for this podcast over at starkreflections.ca, where you can leave a comment as well. You can also reach me on Twitter at Mark Leslie. Thanks for listening to episode 114 of this podcast. So until next episode, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.